All right, so let me know if any of you guys have watched Project Hail Mary. It's the new movie. Right. Yeah, it's pretty good, right? So, if you haven't watched it, imagine you wake up alone, millions of miles from Earth, and you're Ryland Grace, a scientist, and you're the last hope for a dying Earth. And so one day, knock, 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 outside of your spaceship, and you see an alien. It has 5 legs, it's made out of rock, and obviously you can't speak his language. And so he talks in musical notes, like a little chord organ, and his name, once you can finally ask, takes 5 full seconds to say. So you just call him Rocky. For me, the most interesting thing about Project Hail Mary is how two creatures who have no way to talk to each other slowly begin to connect. And so he gives Rocky a voice.
Question. Don't like that.
Cannot hear it.
Scary.
Let's try this.
Ooh.
Nope.
Why is a
Nope.
school teacher
No need.
in space?
No need to. You can continue. Good. Nope.
Why is a school teacher in space? What's so funny? Question.
Why is a school teacher in space?
I mean,
It has charm, but no.
Why is a school teacher in space?
Why is a school teacher in space?
that's not bad.
I like.
All right. And in answer to your question, I have no idea what I'm doing in space. I don't remember.
Okay, so the reason that he did this was because they needed to find a suitable voice that he found very comfortable to talk to on a daily basis. And so this scene works because it gets at something that we all understand. A voice is not just a sound, it's what builds trust.
So think about your own life. You can hear 3 words down the hall, and you know instantly that it's your mom. And then when your friend calls you and you hear, hey, it's me, you already know who me is just through those 3 words alone. And that's the power of voice. It can carry our identity, it carries our memories, and it carries a kind of emotional proof that our brains adapt to almost immediately. And that's exactly what makes this technology both fascinating, but also kind of scary. Because the same thing that makes a familiar voice comforting can also make it easy to trust the wrong person. So today we want to show both sides, how synthetic voices can help people and how the same technology can be used to harm them.
So we saw the challenges grandparents face living alone, such as the daily struggle of managing multiple medications. And we noticed that existing technology often felt cold and complicated. We use voice cloning and are connected to MIT App Inventor. And the app includes safety features and critical functions for seniors, such as medication reminders and prescription management, all delivered in the comforting voice of a loved one.
This is your prescription for azithromycin, which is an antibiotic used to treat a variety of bacterial infections. You need to take 2 tablets by mouth on the first day.
And it also has different languages.
Esta es su receta para acitromicina. 这是您开处方的阿七霉素。
Yeah, but the same technology that makes our reminders sound like family is the same technology that scammers can use to harm them.
Are now using AI to clone voices to trick unsuspecting victims. CBS's Carter Evans takes a look at this frightening new technology in our continuing series, The Age of AI.
Jennifer DeStefano will never forget the frantic call she got from her 15-year-old daughter, Brianna.
And she goes, Mom, it's bad, and help me, help me, help me, help me. And this man gets on, very aggressive, looks at her and her daughter, and then that's when I went to panic mode.
The man demanded $1 million.
I said that wasn't possible. So then he came up with the $50,000.
She never paid the money and would soon learn the call was a popular AI scam. New software can recreate the voices of loved ones in distress, and scammers use that to ask for large sums of money.
I heard our daughter on the phone, like it was unmistakably her.
Americans lost nearly $9 billion to fraud last year alone, up more than 150% in just 2 years.
Yeah, so keep in mind that video is from 2023, so the statistics are slightly different now. But in 2025 alone, Americans over 60 years old, reported $7.7 billion lost in fraud to the FBI. And that's up 59% in a single year. And voice cloning scams like these are only going to keep growing faster and faster. And it only takes as little as 3 seconds of audio to clone someone's voice. And that can come in any form, such as a video that was posted on Facebook of someone's birthday party, like a TikTok that someone posted, or even like a school play that was on YouTube.
So, how do you build a voice system that helps people without handing scammers a better weapon? Our answer is a misuse-aware design framework with 5 concepts. The goal is pretty simple. Keep the benefit, but make it much harder for the same system to teach the wrong lesson. So, number 1, force transparency. The system should never pretend to be human. It says so with a loud or clear label on the screen that this is an AI-generated voice. Most apps hide that this voice is synthetic, but we try to do the opposite. The user should always know what they are hearing. Number 2. Constrained functionality. So the app is locked to low-risk tasks such as reminders and check-ins. And on the other hand, if you want to ask about money, a password, or an account number, it will simply refuse or redirect. A scammer's entire goal is to get you to act on sensitive things, so we built a system that can't by design.
Now, for number 3, we have embedded awareness cues. So when anything sensitive comes up, the app actively coaches the user by telling them to verify the information. For example, text your daughter or call her back. And so through this, every interaction can become a small lesson in never trusting solely just a voice. So in number 4, we have caregiver integration. So this ensures that a real person is still part of the system. So through this, a family member can set limits and review logs, and also notice patterns, such as when someone becomes overly dependent on this voice, or even when they start treating them like a real conversation partner. So 5th and finally, we have adjustable realism. So because the voices don't always have to be a perfect clone. In fact, it might actually be better if it's not completely the same, but familiar enough but still distinguishable from the real person. So it just has to be warm enough to comfort the user, but still artificial enough to remind them that this is still technology and not a real person that they're talking to. And together, these 5 principles allow our app to do 2 things at once. So on the surface, it supports the user with reminders and familiar care. Underneath that, it teaches them every day that a familiar voice is not always complete proof of who is speaking. So for many older adults, our app might be their first experience, first real experience or interaction with a synthetic voice in an app. And we would rather that first experience happen in this safe and labeled environment that they know is artificial, instead of through a panic-filled scam call at 2 a.m. in the morning like we saw in that YouTube video. So we're both helping them remember their pills and other medications, and also training them to keep their guard up.
So in Project Hail Mary, Grace and Rocky do not survive because they blindly trust each other. They survive because they learn how to communicate. They build trust slowly with tools, patience, and understanding. That's how we think about AI voice technology too. We can't solve this problem just by building a smarter filter or a better detector. The fakes will keep improving, and the voices will just keep sounding more real. But there's one thing a scammer can't trick: a person who has learned to stop and question who they are hearing. That's why the education part matters so much. The label, the caregiver settings, the medical instructions, and the reminder to double-check sensitive requests are small lessons repeated over time that help prevent scams like these from happening. So when a real scam call happens, the goal is for the senior not to panic and not to instantly believe in the voice either. They should pause for a second and say, "Let me call you back," just to make sure.
And that pause can make all the difference. And that's what we're trying to build towards. We're not trying to make older adults scared of AI or panic over every single phone call that they get. We're trying to give them enough experience with this technology so that it can feel both understandable and instead of mysterious, and make it so that it's something that they've actually encountered before. And because the voices are only going to keep getting better, that part is not going to be going away. But if people understand just how these voices are made and have experience and interact with them before, and understand what they can and can't prove, they'll have a much better chance of protecting themselves from harmful scams that are based on these. So for us, finding a voice means 2 things. It means giving an AI assistant a voice that feels familiar and helpful, but it can also mean helping senior citizens keep their own voice and judgment when technology tries to sound like someone that they trust. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, okay, fine. Yeah, let us know if you have any questions.
Yeah, I have a question. It's actually kind of an open question, but have you ever thought, what if the system gets hacked and a scammer or a hacker tries to mislead the senior people into taking some wrong medicines, for example?
Okay, so I think it has only access to, like my voice only has access to the app, and so a hacker won't be able to manipulate the app in any way, and it's completely local. So, for example, it can like run offline or anything.
Okay, so it's like completely offline.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that is, we can see if that might be a possibility, and we can try to minimize that. But in other words, currently, I don't think that's a case. Yeah.
Yep,
but thanks for pointing that out.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
What, like, did you use a cloud AI or did you use some kind of local AI for the?
So right now we have, it's called, 11 Labs. And 11 Labs, that's also very useful because in some parts of the model, you can change how realistic it sounds. For example, it can go back to like sounding a little bit more robotic, but still sound like the actual person, or have all the realistic like voice characteristics that you usually hear in day-to-day speech.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Valley problem. So you mentioned wanting to make the voice warm enough, but at the same time not make it too trustworthy because you want it to still appear as an AI.
Yeah.
And,
so. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Do you want to
no, go ahead. I'm just curious how you thought about that problem.
Okay, so we're definitely gonna make use of disclaimers, and because it's gonna be distributed through having like the caregivers letting them know, oh, this is exactly what's gonna happen. You're hearing this voice, but it's not actually them. It can always have an option like you don't want to actually hear the voice. You can just hear like a regular robotic voice, but in that case, disclaimers, especially through the guidance of your caregivers, it will help minimize the uncanny valley effect. Yeah.
And also, if you're worried about like voices being too similar, like maybe an elderly citizen wants to hear a voice that sounds exactly like one of their grandchildren, for example. That's again where the disclaimers come in, so that it makes sure that they can feel comfortable, but just not fully dependent on it as if it was a real person that they know.
Great, thank you, good gentlemen. Can we thank our speakers one last time? So next we have Jason Dang. Jason, could you come on down? Thank you. So Jason's going to be talking to us about detecting Parkinson's disease using voice signals.
Good afternoon. My name is Jason Dang, and today I'll be presenting my research on detecting Parkinson's disease using voice signals and deep learning models. This project explores whether artificial intelligence can analyze simple voice recordings in order to identify signs of Parkinson's disease. And I'm a student at Horace Greeley High School under the mentorship of Professor Fei Wang at Weill Cornell Medicine. So Parkinson's disease affects over 10 million people worldwide, with 90,000 new diagnoses in the United States alone each year. About 500,000 Americans are medically diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, but because symptoms often go unrecognized for long periods of time, experts estimate that the real number may be closer to 1.1 million. One reason for this is that diagnosis isn't straightforward. Currently, methods of diagnosis requires neurological exams, clinical observations of motor symptoms, or in some cases, more invasive procedures such as cerebrospinal fluid testing. Even for experienced neurologists, detecting Parkinson's at early stages may be especially challenging, especially because symptoms go unnoticed for so long. One of the biggest limitations is that motor symptoms such as tremors, rigidity, or slowed movement often only appear after major neurological damage has already occurred. However, there is one symptom that is often overlooked, which is changes in voice and speech. Studies show that 80 to 90% of Parkinson's disease patients experience some sort of vocal disorder. And importantly, these can often appear before the more obvious motor symptoms, though they're a lot more subtle. Because voice recordings are non-invasive, inexpensive, and can be collected and analyzed remotely, this gives voice the potential to be used as a non-invasive biomarker for Parkinson's disease screening. The goal of this project isn't to replace neurologists, but to serve as a tool that can be used to identify patients who should undergo further evaluation. While current studies have looked into this task, major methodological challenges still remain. First, most studies use smaller private data sets, which can lead to limited reproducibility. Second, speaker overlap between training and testing sets often occurs in these prior studies, meaning that recordings from the same participant may appear in both training and testing sets for the models, which could lead to an inflated performance. And third, studies using hybrid architectures often fail to make fair comparisons to more simpler baseline models. In order to address these limitations, my study makes three main contributions. First, I employ a hybrid CNN-LSTM architecture to allow for both spatial and temporal feature modeling. Second, I use speaker-independent nested cross-validation for a rigorous validation framework and to completely prevent speaker overlap. And third, I'll compare my hybrid architecture to two more simpler baselines across or using identical experimental conditions for accurate and fair comparisons. For my project, I used a dataset called the Italian Parkinson's Voice and Speech Dataset, which contains voice recordings from Parkinson's disease patients and healthy controls. I selected this dataset specifically because they provided raw audio recordings rather than pre-extracted features, which can allow me to redo the entire pre-processing pipeline. This dataset contains 50 participants. 22 of them are healthy controls, and 28 of them are Parkinson's disease patients. Each participant provided 10 voice recordings of sustained vowel phonations, leading to a total of 500 samples. And I chose sustained vowel phonations specifically because they are a stable vocal signal and because they minimize linguistic variability due to things like languages, accents, or speaking styles. And this helps make Parkinson's disease-related abnormalities easier for the model to detect. Before training, several pre-processing steps must be done. So first, the audio recordings are converted to mono and resampled to 16 kilohertz for a consistency across all samples. Leading and trailing silences were also removed, which allows for a continuous vowel sound and prevents the model from learning irrelevant information from the silences. I then extracted a standardized 5-second segment from each model, which allows for an equal length recording, and converted them into a MEL spectrogram, which is simply just a 2D image of audio showing mainly frequency and amplitude changes over time. And so the model just looks at, instead of looking at the waveform directly, it's able to look for patterns within these spectrograms to identify signs of Parkinson's disease. Now let's look into how the model actually works. So this is a hybrid architecture that combines two neural networks. The first is a convolutional neural network, or a CNN, which is commonly used for images because they excel at identifying local visual patterns. And for this, it basically just looks at the spectrograms and learns frequency-based patterns such as pitch stability. Once the spatial features are extracted, they are then reshaped into a sequence and passed to an LSTM, or a long short-term memory, which, unlike a CNN, is good with sequential data. So for this, it's able to identify vocal patterns over time from the recordings. By combining both CNN and an LSTM, the model can capture both spectral information and temporal dynamics from the spectrograms, which are both things that are affected by Parkinson's disease. The model was then trained using binary cross-entropy loss with the atom optimizer along with early stopping in order to prevent overfitting, which is basically just the model memorizing data rather than actually learning patterns from it. One aspect of this study that I placed particular emphasis on was developing a rigorous evaluation strategy. Many previous studies report high accuracies, but these can often be overly optimistic mainly because of speaker overlap, meaning that recordings from the same individual may appear in both training and testing sets. To address this, I use speaker-independent nested cross-validation. Speaker independent means that recordings from the same participant cannot appear in both training and testing sets. And nested cross-validation is an evaluation framework that separates a parameter selection process and evaluation, where the inner loop is used for hyperparameter selection, and then the outer loop is used to evaluate the model on completely unseen participants, which helps prevent overfitting and less bias. This model was then evaluated on several metrics, including ROC-AUC, accuracy, precision, recall, and F1 score. And using these multiple metrics can help create a more comprehensive assessment of the model. So for the results, the hybrid architecture achieved the strongest overall performance with an 89.2% accuracy, which outperforms both baselines across all nested cross-validation folds. It also achieved a 0.961 ROC-AUC, which means that it had an excellent discrimination between healthy controls and Parkinson's disease patients. On this ROC curve, you can see that it consistently had a high true positive and low false positive score. On this table, we can see that the CNN baseline was weakest, meaning that spatial and spectral features alone may not entirely capture the complex vocal changes associated with Parkinson's. And then the LSTM baseline performed better, meaning that temporal patterns are also important for this. However, both baselines were worse than the hybrid architecture, and when combined, spectral information and temporal dynamics can help create an overall better model, which likely led to the improved performance. Importantly, these results came from rigorous nested cross-validation, meaning that the model was evaluated on completely unseen participants, so that the reported performance provides greater confidence that it actually learned Parkinson's disease-related vocal patterns rather than just memorizing the data. And overall, these findings suggest that combining CNN and LSTM models improve accuracy over using just one independently. However, there are several important limitations to note. So first, the dataset size, while 500 samples seems like a lot, it only comes from 50 participants, and using a larger and more diverse dataset could help improve generalizability. These recordings in the dataset were also recorded under controlled settings, which with minimal background noise, microphones, and recording quality. And in the future, it would try to use more realistic conditions with more variability to help improve generalizability. And third, there hasn't been any clinical evaluation for this model yet. This study pretty much just demonstrates the feasibility of this task, but it does not show the clinical readiness of it yet. In the future, I want to try to expand towards larger and more diverse data sets to improve generalizability. And I also want to explore different architectures such as transformer-based models. I also want to evaluate this model clinically and potentially expand this for detecting Parkinson's disease severity using something called UPDRS score, which simply just is a way to measure how severe someone's symptoms are. So in conclusion, this study demonstrates that combining CNN and RNN can effectively analyze voice for Parkinson's disease detection. And my hybrid architecture outperformed both baselines across all evaluation metrics whilst using rigorous evaluation. Although further clinical evaluation is needed, this supports the growing potential for voice as a digital biomarker. And in the future, hopefully this research can help make neurological screening more accessible, low cost, and available remotely. Thank you for listening.
Okay, any questions for Jason? All right, Kelly, do you want to go first?
It's going to be me. So leaving aside the question of whether you're really in high school, this is a pretty impressive piece of work. This is either really easy or really hard, but there's quite a lot of medical conditions that lead to vocalization changes, foreign language syndrome, different types of aphasias. So how are you isolating Parkinson's specifically among that subset? Is there a very unique vocalization pattern that's linked to Parkinson's previously, or yeah, could you just comment on that a little?
Yeah, so there are definitely like others like neurological diseases that affect voice similar to Parkinson's disease, but right now I haven't looked into looking at different diseases since the data sets don't have the data from like other diseases, for example. But in the future, I would like to look into other diseases and see if this model would able to detect like a variety of diseases, for example, and be able to distinguish them from one another.
Thank you.
I also have a question, more on the design a little bit. Well, you did the cross-fold validation, and did you also consider like a leave one out type validation so you could maximize the amount of training data and then verify on either a subject who didn't have Parkinson's or a subject who did have Parkinson's?
Yeah, so the cross-validation thing I used, basically it did that, but like it did that twice. So in an early loop, it left out one like set of participants for the hyperparameter selection, and then I looped on that on like an outer loop, which left out another set of participants. So the model was basically trained on completely unseen participants over 5 times.
Okay, great. Any other questions from the audience? All right. Well, thank you very much, Jason. And then we'll have our last speaker of the day before we move on to the other events in the afternoon. So Lucas Yang, come on down. Lucas is going to be talking to us about a computational app for evaluating colorblind-friendly designs.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lucas Zhang, and today I'll be presenting you guys on my app for computationally quantifying the effects of color blindness on color design. Imagine if you're colorblind. These numbers here, they could appear invisible to you. And this isn't just a fluke of this situation, but rather this invisibility could transfer over to something when you're trying to look for supposed safety signage, or if you're just looking at a map. You would be missing crucial color information without even knowing it. This is color vision deficiency, or CVD. CVD affects over 350 million people worldwide. And this loss of color information isn't just an inconvenience. It's an information accessibility gap that affects lives every single day. But the question is, how do we assess if the designs people interact with on a daily basis are actually colorblind friendly? The modern way of assessing color accessibility is still stuck with color blindness simulations, where you just simulate one version of it and use qualitative inspection to see how it looks. There's also a set of predetermined safe color palettes, but these are relatively limited. And even if they're okay to use, they're not very easy to adapt to various complex situations. So what we're going to take a look at is to create something that is actually able to tell us how color accessible a specific image is, and not just a general idea. So our solution is to create a mathematically and computationally to provide a quick and objective way to provide a metric for color accessibility. We have 3 main components here. First is a mathematical model for color accessibility for color vision deficiency. Second is a variance-based metric in that model. And finally, we have an app that allows us to have an easy and simple interface to upload an image and get a result back. So first, to understand how we're even going to do this, we first need to understand how humans actually perceive color. In our retinas, there are 3 types of cones, and these are the L, M, and S cone, and they're each responsible for a different branch of wavelengths. And so combined, they allow for us to have trichromatic color vision. And so we need to focus on how to mathematically model human color perception. In the modern digital world, we commonly use the color space called RGB, but this means nothing to humans, and this is basically just telling us how bright each different color is in our displays. And so we want to utilize the LMS color space instead, which is directly based off of human biological vision and color vision. And so this creates a good foundation for a mathematical model of CVD. And so what we want to do next is convert from RGB to LMS. And so to do that, it's actually quite simple. RGB is a 3-dimensional color space. LMS is also a 3-dimensional color space. And so from one specific RGB space, we can just apply a matrix multiplication to it and get the LMS point. But we've talked lots about CVD and color vision deficiency, but what is it actually fundamentally? Color vision deficiency, or color blindness, occurs when one or more of the cones in our eyes are absent or malfunctioning. There are 3 main forms with each individual cone missing, where we have protanopia with the L cone missing, deuteranopia with M, tritanopia with S. And so we can, in the LMS color space, we can pretty easily model this color vision deficiency by simply compressing from a 3-dimensional space into a 2-dimensional plane. And so this often causes certain combinations of color to become really difficult to distinguish. And this commonly most commonly occurred when the variance between the two color points is found almost purely inside of the axis that is lost when we compress. So to actually measure how much information is lost, we need to take a look at what information and how to measure information in this space. So we use a variance space metric, and basically if we consider that if all of the colors in the if all the colors within our image are like widely distributed throughout the entire LMS space, there would be high variance, and we would be able to pick out a lot of color information from that. But if the colors were concentrated within the space, there'd be much lower variance, much less color information to use. And so we use variance along each of the three axes to pick out how much information there is inside within our image. And so we can define a total color information with that. And so through total color information, what we're doing is we're just adding up the variances of the color points along each of the three axes, L, M, and S. That's for someone with normal color vision, where they have access to all three of the cones. But for someone with color blindness, they lose one of these cones. And so they would only be able to get the variance from two of these axes. So for like protanopia, it would be just from the M and S axes. And so that gives us how we're going to get our reading difficulty score. So information retained is just the proportion of information, the fraction of color information that's retained after we have CVD considered. So it's just the information that's left remaining that someone with CVD could pick up, divided by the total information. Reading difficulty is just the fraction of color information that someone loses, and so just 1 minus our information retained. And so the overall app interface and the app workflow is quite simple, and we're just going to be calculating the reading difficulty score. And so I implemented the application through Python with the use of 3 main libraries, NumPy, Pillow, and Dash. So Pillow is this great library that's used for image processing, where we can convert any uploaded image into some specific value. Numerical values such as the RGB color space, where we can then convert to LMS. Then we have NumPy, which is used to do matrix operations, vectorized operations, and finally Dash to show us the display and display our application. And so the workflow of the app is basically we have the user upload an image. They could also take a picture, and then it's converted from RGB to LMS. Then finally we use the variance calculator from the LMS space to compute our reading difficulty score. And finally it's displayed to the screen. So next, I want to look at 2 real-world applications for this. First, we take a look at some traffic lights, and then we're going to look at some art, because that's always fun. So for the traffic lights, I found the most commonly used 3 colors from the Federal Highway Administration's Manual for Uniform Traffic Control Displays. And so with these 3 RGB values, because there's only 3, we can actually calculate the reading difficulty by hand. And so with these 3 RGB values, we normalize them, we convert, we do a gamma reversion that's commonly found in sRGB to get to a linear RGB space, which is then how we convert to LMS. From those LMS values, we can compute the variance along each of the axes, and then finally put all our variance numbers together to get reading difficulty scores for each of the 3 color blindness types. And so we can see that for protons and deutens, they have much higher reading difficulty than those with tritanopia, which is to be expected because the traffic light is lots of red and green combinations, which is what they struggle with the most. Our second real-world application is going to be taking a look at some of Claude Monet's paintings. Claude Monet was a French Impressionist artist, but in the later years of his life, he started to develop cataracts, which altered his color vision significantly. It's reported that he lost most of his sensitivity to L and M cones. And so what that means is his last few paintings were primarily dominated with information along the S-axis, lots of different shades of blue and things like that. And so what we would expect is if all the information within his paintings were concentrated along the S-axis, that means someone with tritanopia would lose a lot of information. And so we predict that there would be high reading difficulty for someone with tritanopia. And so taking a look at this first painting, we can see that our app correctly tells us that tritanopia has a really high reading difficulty of 82%, while protanopia and deuteranopia are much lower. And our second painting even further confirms this pattern, where we have tritanopia at a 97.9% of reading difficulty with a much lower protanopia and deuteranopia scores. And so this basically confirms that our model is correctly and follows real-world patterns with these paintings here. And so a few key takeaways that I would like to get into would be how we are utilizing a mathematical framework for color accessibility and color vision deficiency. The second thing is we're computing an objective score, an objective metric for reading difficulty based off of variance, a pretty commonly used mathematical concept. And third and fourth, we have an interactive app that allows us to really quickly get these computed values. And finally, we're doing this all in support of greater accessibility and inclusive visual designs. And so some of the biggest implications for this tool and this presentation in general is to help bring more attention to high-end designers' awareness of the effects of color blindness on inclusivity and accessibility of color designs, to allow them to take a more proactive approach to color designs, where they can easily see if their designs are friendly to the colorblind. And so, of course, there's limitations to this. And the main thing is we're only considering 3 types of color blindness. These are the 3 main types of color blindness, but there's also always complexities between different people and the types of color blindness they have in the more complex forms. And so we might not be able to fully capture all the details of someone with more severe color blindness. In the future, I would, of course, like to expand to more types of color blindness, how to increase that, and also consider the facts of how the various color axes could impact the others in terms of how information is retained. And so here are some of my resources that I used, and thank you for listening. Do you guys have any questions?
Okay, any questions for Lucas? I have one. I'm kind of curious to learn a little bit more about how you combine the color information in the painting. Because obviously you're going pixel by pixel, so one question I would have is if I randomize the location of all the pixels, would I still get the same number even though the image would be completely random?
So the formulas that I showed were not fully complete. There's a small gap there where we actually are taking localized patches, where we're checking the color information along in the information loss in each localized area. But to save time and complexity, I just discussed it as the idea of the reading difficulty score being the variance of the information stored in one axis divided by the total loss. But in reality, when it's actually computed, it's based off of various patches of localized areas, so that the information loss is dependent on how the pixels are arranged, and you can't just scramble the image.
Okay, so similar to like how a CNN works, where you're just getting across. So did you vary the window at all, and did you see any patterns in terms of the size of the window?
There wasn't too much impact on that.
Okay, very interesting. Anyone else have any questions? All right, well, thank you very much, Lucas.
Thanks for having me.
So that concludes our talks for the afternoon.